Hi, and welcome back to part three. Uh, this is to close off this week's lecture, week two of communication and media. We'll just review briefly the form of communication that we discussed in the previous clip, looking specifically at President Trump's rhetoric. So that form of communication is regarded as verbal communication. There are some other types of communication that we commonly find ourselves engaged with and may be considering as we go on through the course. So the second one is non-verbal communication. Obviously there's verbal communication, which is how people speak. Then there's all the other ways that we communicate without speaking, and this is typically experienced through how we interpret other people's body posture, facial expressions, eye movements, which is very, very important in social interactions and in one-on-one communication. But non-verbal communication also is experienced in things like performances and dance and art and music, and not only art in terms of paintings on the wall, but also sculptures and photography and so on and so on. Okay, performances and dance, so we can also experience non-verbal communication in dramatic performances. The third form of communication, written communication. So texts in all forms, which can contain the same information in terms of the words on the page, but a handwritten note might be interpreted differently from a typed letter, might be considered differently to an email, to an SMS, or a social media post, and so on. But all of these are considered written communication. So is, a graffiti on a wall. So is a novel. So is many other things. So those are three forms: verbal, non-verbal, and written. Now these can often be combined. So, for example, at the moment you are reading these words on the screen. Here they are. You are listening to me. Sometimes read them out and sometimes discuss them, and you are also seeing my facial gestures and my hands doing all this type of stuff. So all three forms of communication are involved here. And if you consider something like cinema, for example, often there is verbal communication, there's the dialogue, there's a lot of visual communication, non-verbal visual communication, costuming, backdrops, lighting, all those sorts of things which are part of the kind of visual grammar of cinema. And from time to time there might also be written communication which is included in the movie, whether that be stuff that the actors are actually reading or seeing, or it might be a subtitle or those sorts of things, a timestamp. So in other words, these forms of communication can be combined. They're not always separate. So forms of communication, now we're talking about types of communication. And forms, types, don't get hung up on the difference between what's a form and what's a type. We're just making a distinction here. As I said, calling something a form of communication or a type of communication is just a handy shorthand for us to talk a little bit about these different categories of when we're talking about communication. So one form of communication that we use all the time, interpersonal communication. Now, oftentimes this is between two individuals, a conversation between two people. Includes verbal and non-verbal interactions. Particularly things like facial gestures and also how proximate we are to one another and so on. It can be more than two people. So, for example, a job interview is an interesting interpersonal communication where it's normally one person and then a panel might be, typically it's three people on one side, but that's an interpersonal communication. Now, there are certain kind of like codes and rules that govern this type of communication that you kind of have to know, and you probably know a lot of these, or you think you know them. And they include things like being a good listener and how to take turns in a conversation, and being aware of non-verbal communication skills and how to prepare for the type of communication that you're in. And this, very interestingly, can vary from culture to culture, which we'll get into a little bit. So some of the different factors that can affect interpersonal communication: gender, age, culture, values, rapport and relationship. Rapport is the strength of the feeling that you have. That you have if you have a strong sense of rapport, you feel kind of like close to one another. And socioeconomic status or otherwise class. So just some big things that I've experienced as I've communicated in different cultures around the world. So some of these are quite interesting, and they can kind of catch you up a little bit if you're not aware of them. So, for example, in Australian culture, Australian speaking culture. Now, these are generalizations, of course, but generally speaking, in Australian speaking culture, more so in American culture and a little bit less so in British culture, as I understand. We don't like spaces left between people speaking. So if someone stops speaking, then someone else will talk. But we don't always like people speaking over the top of one another. In America, that's a little bit more common for people to talk over the top of one another. In some other cultures, for example, some southern Mediterranean cultures, so like if you've ever spent time with Italian people, oftentimes they'll just talk over the top of one another, and that's considered to be fine. It's not a problem. Whereas myself, actually, personally, being brought up in Australian culture, if someone else is talking, I can't talk. I have to stop and I have to listen. But if no one is talking, I feel the need to fill up that space. It feels like there's this dead air there, and it feels like, oh, I have to keep on talking. But I've spent a lot of time, for example, with Japanese people, and if there's oftentimes in a conversation, and especially if it's a little bit more formal conversation or people who you're not, very, very close to, what is common is a pause when someone's finished speaking. So, for example, I would stop speaking and then. See, it's already feeling a little bit uncomfortable, isn't it? So I stop speaking, and then the other person might do that, and then they'll start talking again. And when I first encountered this, it made me so uncomfortable that after a while I got used to it. And there's actually something really nice about it, where there's this space and time where people kind of indicate that they're giving the proper amount of thought to what you've said before they're replying to you. Again, it's a generalization, so not everyone's like this all the time. But think also about the different ways that you interact with people, even who are close to you. So even members of your family. If you have there's an older level of your family, so not only your mum and dad, but you might have uncles and aunts, and then there's your grandparents, and you might use different forms of speech with them. Your grandparents compared to your parents compared to your aunties. That's a product of not only age, but also the type of relationship and the sense of rapport that you have. Then it might be your brothers and sisters and your cousins, so you might speak with them very differently. And so on, so on. And that can vary quite a bit from culture to culture also. Also, things like gender. So, do you interact interpersonally the same way with your mum as with your dad? Oftentimes in Australia, we tend to treat them not too differently. In some other cultures, it's very different to how you communicate with your mother versus your father, and I know that in my my grandparents' generation, it would have been very different to how it is now. But also things like gender is very different. For example, when you meet someone and you're if it's the context, for example, you meet someone on a social occasion, and they're roughly the same age as you, and everything's similar, and it's kind of like a friendship group, or you're at a dinner party, or out at drinks or something like that. So what do? Do you shake their hand? Do you kiss them on the cheek? Is it one kiss or is it two kisses? I've even seen 3 kisses. All these things vary quite a bit, and it can be a little bit tricky sometimes to know what to do. Other types of communication. Small group communication focuses on 3 to 15 people interacting. So these are often things like workplaces, parties, pubs, those sorts of things. We do this all the time when we have group activities in class. So there's a little bit more of a power dynamic involved in here, or some kind of like a structure where Those who lead and those who follow, if there's only two of you, everyone has to participate, but in a small group, there will, leaders can emerge, followers, can just determine that they need to follow more than lead. That can vary. So on one occasion, one person might lead, another occasion, another person might lead, and so on and so on. This can be formally structured. So, for example, in a meeting, often someone is delegated the responsibility or assumes the responsibility to kind of facilitate things going on. So, the chair of a meeting will, for example, determine sometimes things like how long we're going to talk about a certain topic, who gets to speak about it, in what order, when we're going to close off the discussion, whether or not you're going to decide, make a decision, who gets to participate in that decision, how are you going to vote, and so on and so on. Okay, so all of those things can be a part of small group communication. Organisational communication extends this to even larger numbers. So an organisation might be a business, it might be a government department, it might be something quite large, like to the extent of it's like a university or a whole government. But organisations, they vary in size, but it could be 20 people, could be 100 people, and it could be 1,000 people, and there is a lot of jobs, a lot of career paths that involve understanding how to communicate with an organisation. So this can be done within HR departments, human resources departments, which deal with how staff feel about their role in their workplace, whether they're valued and whether they can participate in what's going on. It can deal with internal processes or external processes. Corporate networks can be dealing with other companies which an organisation is involved with, or what we might call stakeholders. So stakeholder management includes existing and potential stakeholders. So a stakeholder can include your staff or your customers or the people who are in close proximity to your organisation, so your neighbours, it could be your suppliers, it could be the board, and so on and so on and so on. So anyone who has a stake in what the organisation is trying to achieve. And lastly, we talk about public relations. Relations with the public. Oftentimes this is conflated with media relations, which is, of course, the discussion of how an organisation relates to the news media and the press media, and through them to the public. But public relations also involves stakeholder management, other forms of direct communication, so direct letters to people like customers or shareholders or members of your, for example, members of a club. Or members of a congregation or a temple or those sorts of things. Mass communication is an even bigger number, if you like, and mass communication is communication to this mass audiences. Or there's a phrase which is it sounds a little bit old-fashioned now, called the masses. So if you do hear that, just translate it back into mass audiences, which is kind of like everybody who's within a certain constituency, or so that could be everyone within a country, or everyone within a state, or everyone within a city, depending on how you've defined who your audience is. So communication that aims to target a mass audience often uses things like journalism and public relations to engage with them through mainstream and online media. And we'll get into that quite a bit as we go in through the course. And the next type of communication that we're discussing is which we regard as public communication. So this is talking about one-to-many communication in person. So the speeches that we talked about before are a form of public communication. Speeches, debates, news conferences. Lectures, so when someone stands up in a hall and gives an academic lecture, or in the TED Talks, those are a type of public communication. All kinds of performance, so when you see some street performers, or a a soliloquy that is given on stage, part of a Shakespeare play. That's a classic form of kind of like one-to-many communication. In that case, it's one actor, but also a character in a play performing to the audience that's there in the theatre, or if it's broadcast to a wider audience. That's all we have time for this week.